Welcome to the Performance Compensation Talent Management Committee First Order of Business call to order. Or roll call, please.
Bill Slayton.
Here.
Richard Costigan. Here. Richard Gillihan.
Here.
Dana Hollinger.
Here.
Henry Jones.
Here.
Priya Mather.
Here.
Ramon Rubacava.
He's here, but
Okay.
he's sitting in the back, please.
Oh, there he is.
Never mind him.
All right. And for the record, please note that Mr. Miller, Mr. Seha, and Ms. Brown are here. And next order of business is action consent. Do I have a motion? Move from Jones, second from Costigan. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. All right. On the information consent, nobody's indicated they want to remove anything, so we'll move very quickly to number 5. Actually, I didn't do the executive report. You can combine them.
Mr.
Hoffner.
We can do that if you'd like.
Sure.
It's going to be speaking about number 5 anyway. So good afternoon, Doug Hoffner, CalPERS team member. Today we've got one item for action related to pay philosophy discussion for covered positions. That will be conducted by Grant Thornton, the board's incentive comp consultants. Eric Gonzaga will be presenting that item. I also want to highlight that Andrew Junkin from Wilshire Consulting is also on the phone joining us today. Based on the discussion and the information provided by Marcy related to Ted Iliopoulos yesterday, we thought it was important to have Andrew on as well. There may be some questions related to the CIO position and some of those questions related to compensation. We thought, in addition to the Grant Thornton folks, it would be nice to have Andrew, given his role within the organization from a consulting perspective, to the full board. So he's joining us on the call. This item essentially is going to talk about the pay philosophy within the current board's policy. It's going to have a discussion about some fundamental parameters within that pay philosophy. We wanted to get you to affirm or discuss or modify some of those. We want to get your feedback related to these items. And then we've got some market data that we'll be bringing back through Eric and his team at the June meeting. So effectively having a discussion about philosophy for these covered positions, be able to bring back specific data that you may have questions about in the June meeting for that broader discussion as it relates to these covered items. I also wanted to highlight, we were asked by Mr. Costigan at the last meeting, I think that was in March, to bring back some information on deferred compensation and some specific plans. The team has been working diligently on that. There's been a lot of work with CalHR, a very collaborative process. We did not have enough information today with definitive answers. So I just want to give you a very high overview that it's really complex. Yeah, that's not doing it justice, I guess. But depending on which class of individuals may be in the organization, from classic to pepper, there's different applications of some of these things. So we will defer that to a further discussion. We have the opportunity to bring back a formal written item, but I want you to know we have been working on that, and that will come forward at an appropriate time later this year. With that, I'll just turn this over to both Tina Campbell and Eric Gonzaga for the presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Tina Campbell, CalPERS team. Agenda item 5 is an action item. The committee provided direction in March for team members and the board's executive compensation consultant, Mr. Eric Gonzaga, with Grant Thornton, to work on fixed compensation options for the CalPERS CEO position. Mr. Gonzaga is here to present and discuss the 3 major components of the overall pay philosophy. This discussion will set a foundation from which you can make salary range decisions at a future meeting for the CEO position, as well as other positions covered under the board's compensation policy. Before we transition to Mr. Gonzaga's presentation, I want to highlight key activities and discussions which have occurred over the last few years to bring us to this point. In the last 5 years, the board has adopted revised comparator groups for both investment and executive management positions. In 2015, a comprehensive survey was conducted for both executive and investment management positions, at which time the board approved a revised comparator group for executive management positions. The board indicated a desire for future review, especially in the consideration of the disparity between certain salary ranges or earning opportunities and market 50th percentile. As a result, Grant Thornton was engaged as the board's compensation consultant in 2016 to conduct a comprehensive review of CalPERS incentive programs. Through that process, comparator groups were validated and analysis reconfirmed disparity in market positioning. Grant Thornton prepared several possible considerations for the board to align CalPERS compensation more competitively with the market. Attachment 2 of the agenda item lists those consideration and action taken since that time where applicable. Rather than conducting another survey in 2017, existing data sets were updated and additional salary data was brought forward for the committee's review. Slight salary adjustments to the maximum end of the range were made for some positions at that time, but no further action has been taken. Today, Mr. Gonzaga will set the foundation so the committee can make important compensation structure decisions as we continue to work through the process over the next 2 or 3 meetings. The 2 points of action we're seeking today are 1, for the committee to affirm the policy purpose statement, and 2, for the committee to affirm previously agreed on comparator groups for executive and investment management positions. In addition, Mr. Gonzaga will also review the importance of targeting a comparator group percentile, the process to do that, and how it leads to the outcome of establishing related compensation structures. These 3 components, purpose, comparator group, and comparator group target percentile, collectively set the framework that would become CalPERS' overall pay philosophy. At future meetings, the committee will refer to and consider the pay philosophy when we are discussing today to establish compensation structures for positions covered under the board's related policy. CalPERS team members and Mr. Gonzaga are currently in the process of organizing comparator group salary and total cash data, as well as how the data would translate by applying the overall pay philosophy based on potential target percentiles. This data will be presented at future meetings for the committee's review and decisions. We'll arrange the timeline to ensure the committee's request to have a fixed compensation salary range for the CEO will become effective this fiscal year, July 1st. There will also be opportunities to discuss and decide on salary ranges and overall compensation structures for the remaining positions covered by the board's policy in future meetings. Now I'll turn it over to Mr. Gonzaga, who will lead the discussion on pay philosophy components that I mentioned earlier so the committee can take action on the policy purpose statement and comparator groups, as well as engage in discussion regarding the comparator group target percentile. Mr. Gonzaga or I will be happy to answer questions after or during the presentation. Mr. Gonzaga.
Well, thank you, and good to be here again. What we want to cover today, as it's outlined on that first slide, is really, again, going back to philosophy. What is the philosophy? Well, it's kind of that constitution with which to govern your compensation program. And it's important, just to revisit this on occasion, just to make sure that when we start thinking about recruitment, retention considerations, and in addition to rewards, it's driven by that same neutral strategy, that the committee and the board agrees with. And so what we want to cover today again, are 3 things. 1, let's talk about the purpose of the pay philosophy. Number 2, what are the appropriate peers? And finally, what's the right target percentile? And we have perspectives on all of these various elements. What I will say is that if we go back and look at the work that was done even preceding us, I think that when you think about the complexity of the organization, the work that's been done, certainly I would consider is best practice peer group representing the complexity of this organization, to the extent that you can. I mean, even when you think about, like organizations, there's very few absolutely apples-to-apples type organizations at CalPERS, if only because of the size of the fund itself. So with that in mind, we'll talk about purpose, peers, and target market percentile. The hope is to walk away with affirmation of what those guidelines should be. And then we'll come back in June to discuss specific numbers as it relates to how can we continue to move towards that philosophy. So. Now, in terms of compensation purpose, let's just talk about philosophy and what are the different elements that we're talking about here, just to bring everybody up to stage, because I know there often, as with most boards, there's some turnover in different spots, but the philosophy is really what is your strategy to recruit, retain your fair share of employees. It's that foundational statement. The comparator group is, okay, these are the organizations of like size, like complexity that would represent organizations that have jobs of comparable complexity to those at CalPERS. And finally, that target percentile is, okay, what are we targeting from a pay standpoint? And when I say that, I just want to be very clear that when we say target percentile, it is not where everybody should be positioned. Generally, there should be an array of folks below that midpoint, above that midpoint, based on combination of both organizational, individual performance, and experience. So as we go through this, let's just say we start talking about targeting the 50th percentile. We're not saying every executive, every investment management professional should be positioned right at that 50th percentile. To the contrary, it may be fine for certain individuals to be positioned 20% below that midpoint, or another individual 5 or 10% above that target, depending on experience. So with that, what we want to talk about first is, what is the plan purpose? What is the executive compensation purpose? What are we trying to drive through the CalPERS compensation program? And what you have there in front of you, and I'll just read it quickly, the intent is to recruit and retain highly skilled professionals who are the foundation for CalPERS success, to meet that mission that you all have. And the common principles that you've stated must be high enough to encourage individuals to come aboard and retain them, but not so high that individuals are joining the organization for compensation only. Additionally, it's reactive to the labor markets with which you recruit and retain from. And finally, that there should be a substantial portion that's subject to risk based on performance. Now, with those criteria, do those continue to be, and would you agree with that underlying statement? I think it's eloquent. I think it makes sense from my perspective, but just affirmation in terms of those various elements.
Ms. Mather.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would agree with you that generally I think this still pertains today. The one thing that we might want to consider is on the second line, enough to encourage and maybe add highly qualified individuals to accept and remain in positions. But otherwise, I think I like it as it stands. So I don't know if you want a motion at this time, Mr. Chair, but I'm happy to move the language that we affirm the compensation policy with that one modification.
Okay. All right, I'll accept that as a motion. Is there a second? We can have more discussion. All right, so
Thank you.
Moved and seconded. Further discussion, Ms. Hollinger.
Yes, this is my concern. I think that life has changed, and life has changed in terms of our funded status. And when I went to the Rotman Institute and CPPIB, they look at the compensation, and when you're looking at purpose, and they tie it into their funded status. I think that to really answer our stakeholders, I just saw that when we checked with them, that in 2017, it looked like 70, I don't know if it's 70% or 70 people that felt that their retirement money is safe, the unfunded liability. People are really concerned about the long-term sustainability of the fund. And if we want to drive, I'm not sure if it's necessarily performance, but if we want a message to our stakeholders coming from the board that we care about the funded status, we care about the sustainability, then I think it also has to somehow performance. If the funded status goes down, that's not a good sign. So I think we have to link it to increasing the funded status. And I'm not exactly, I know it's easy to say these things. It's like you don't want to complain about the chef in the kitchen unless you plan on cooking. But I think we really need to send a message to the marketplace. And also, if that message is there, it's going to have everyone in the investment staff focus on the funded status. We have to increase the funded status of this fund.
Well, I think you've raised an interesting point. I think it drives a couple of things in my mind. One is that I think we need to still consider, because of the last sentence, a substantial portion of compensation at risk, that I think we need to still consider the possibility of the CEO compensation still having a portion at significant risk. I think that goes to that issue. So that nobody's compensation is totally fixed. The second thing is the question, is it appropriate to tie to the health of the organization or funded status, which gets very specific, in the compensation policy, or is that in the evaluation model? Is that how we're going to hold management accountable? Should it be in this purpose statement? I just have question about whether it should be here. I'd like to hear from other committee members, because I think that's what I'm hearing you say, is somehow tying it into the wording here.
Yes, because...
Oh, just a minute. Just a minute.
It's my fault.
Okay.
I didn't realize you were going to talk back. I think we have to send that message to the marketplace, and I also think that I think it needs to be in the purpose. Yes, because that people focus on what they get compensated on. Mm-hmm. It's just the way life is.
Well, and we'll take some more comments. I just noticed that we both recognize labor market forces and reinforce maximum performance. And maybe where that maximum performance needs to be is to the benefit of the fund or to the benefit of the members. And maybe that gets to the point. You keep cutting off. Just a second.
Oh.
Now.
My other point to make in that context, the reason I like funded status is because I come from insurance, so I don't want somebody to take an inordinate amount of risk to achieve necessarily a great return, but that would jeopardize our funded status. I think there's a balance. It's got to be a risk-adjusted return. So I think it also keeps that in line, the level of risk.
Okay, well, let's hear from some others.
Okay.
Mr. Costigan.
Thank you, Mr. Slayton. So I appreciate the report. I mean, this has been a struggle of mine over the years. I've moved from they're civil servants who have protections that the private sector doesn't have. That's where I started off, and that's from the other hat I wear at SPB, because, there's a balance between compensation and the protections. I think Ms. Hollinger is right. On one hand, you look at total fund performance and the activities. On the flip side, because they are not at-will employees, oftentimes the protections of civil service come into play, but I don't think the investment staff or our executive staff actually look at it the same way. They really look towards compensation and pride of performance. And over the last few years, I've had this sort of transition. When we look at 1.9 million members and 1.5 million on the pension side, and we're the largest healthcare and we're the largest pension fund, we're not going to pay, and not to get too much into what happened on Monday, but when we have this discussion on Monday about where investment committee and investments may go, we've really got to start recognizing how things are changing, and that starts from the CEO down. You hold the CEO, how do you attract someone to we have to think we're a 360, whatever we are today, billion-dollar organization with over 2,800 employees that has a multi-billion-dollar impact on the state of California, and then we have a global presence. And so when you look at compensation, I'm not saying don't move away from total fund. I think that's an element of it, but our compensation is just really the realization I've had a couple last years is it's just too low. We're not attracting quality candidates. The quality candidates who want to come here are in fact are negatively impacted both because of the salary levels, and then I know that Mr. Hoffner as we were talking earlier about some additional types of incentive comp, and not just necessarily going to get into it, but one of the reasons that we looked at these models is as a result of the federal tax policies. Someone coming to California is now subject to the $10,000 on state income tax and property taxes. I mean, you already know in California the average property tax is close to 10 grand, and so all of a sudden we're creating these economic disincentives already with low wages to begin with, vis-a-vis the other peer groups that you use. To now say, if we're just going to tie it into solely fund performance or make that a big element of it, I'm just concerned with that. I really think we should be looking at moving compensation up, beginning to pay it. I think the board acknowledges, I'll talk on the investment side, we're paying millions in fees to outside managers. We ought to begin addressing that inside. It's a cost. It does lead to cost control, allows us to control our costs more as we look at bringing these salaries up. So I'm not sure, Mr. Slayton, how we're looking as a committee moving forward. I think some element of the board retaining some discretion over awarding a bonus is there. Although my argument is, as it relates to the CEO, we have the ultimate discretion because we can tell her, thank you very much, you're out of here in 33 minutes, because it's an at-will employee. After that, we have to empower the CEO to bring in the best type of folks in order to meet our objectives for our members, and that means moving up. We're not going to go to the top quartile. That's just, again, we're a state agency. There are certain things, and we're not like some of the Canadian systems. But we need to be moving our salaries up. We're a transitional organization. We are changing. Our portfolio is getting more diverse. Our membership is getting more diverse. The pressures that we're getting from the legislature, the executive branch, whether it's ESG, you name it, the professionalization of our staff is important. Compensation drives that. So I would support at some point, whether it's next month or if you need something this, and we begin looking at increasing the salary for starting with our CEO and others, and what the incentive package should look like. But where we are now is not acceptable to me. Thank you.
Mr. Gillihan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hesitate to speak on these topics because it often puts me in a difficult position, but I agree on some level that we have to pay these folks enough to get the people with the skill sets we need. And it looks like we're going to put that to the test fairly shortly here. But with respect to Ms. Hollinger's comments, I agree one critical measure is our funded status, but kind of leaning in the direction of what Mr. Costigan just said, tying it back to Ms. Hollinger's comments, is that this board takes actions that affect our funded status. It also takes actions that affect our risk appetite. The board establishes risk, and our investment staff operate within very tight tolerances within the risk appetite that's established by the board. So they only have so much wiggle room to produce excess gains or to manage within the box we put them in. And the same thing on the discount rate. We make a change, whether it's on the rate or on other assumptions, and we recalculate our unfunded liability, and the ratios change. So I guess my point is, I agree that the funded status should be a significant performance indicator, but I also agree with Mr. Costigan that this board needs to retain the flexibility to adjust for those things for which we've sort of constrained their ability to perform, or how a measurement reflects back on staff when it's actually more a reflection of a board decision. Thank you.
Mr. Rubalcava.
Thank you, Chair. This is very new to me, and this whole thing about compensation policy. But as I read the presentation, I think it is what we have here is a very solid policy statement. And like somebody mentioned, there is an acknowledgement that some of the compensation will be put at risk. So the question is this statement, does it work for us, or it needs to be modified? I support that there should be something about highly skilled, but to follow on some of the statements that were made by our colleagues here is that this board does establish the benchmarks. We do, for the various asset classes, we do set up some of the funding policy and the strategic allocation, asset allocation, stuff like that. So I think a lot of it falls on the recruitment process, and I would say the evaluation process. So the question is, do we affirm or modify the statement. I think I'm in a position, I think this works for us. I don't think, if we put funded status in there, I think it's almost tailing what the press is saying, that somehow that's the only judge of how sound the fund is, and I don't think it is. I think it's, are we meeting our benchmarks, are we relative to the market and where everybody else? So I would say we should not, I'm not sure how much work came into the statement, but I like it. So let me leave it at that in my new member look. Thank you.
Mr. Jones.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with Rubalcaba on this, and I would support Priya's suggestion, highly skilled. But I think we can't walk away from what Dana was saying, and perhaps maybe how we address that is some kind of introduction to this whole area. You talk about, the funded status or whatever else you want to do to lead into this, rather than trying to make this particular purpose statement to deal with a broader issue. And so, but I think I assume that eventually there's going to be some narrative around these items. And so the introduction to this would be, I think, the appropriate place to go with some kind of language that Dana is talking about.
Yeah, I tend to agree. This is a compensation policy. We could go down the rabbit hole of adding all the different things that we want people to do as a result of that. But I think we need to stay at a relatively high level at this point. And then when we get into how the compensation plans are constructed, then you get to what levers you want pushed based on what results we want to achieve. And I think that we're going to get to a point, and I don't know whether it's going to be today or in June, we're going to have a conversation about where this committee's role is versus the CEO when it comes to the people who she hires and engages, and what level of detail beyond setting the ranges. Because our fiduciary responsibility, absolutely, we have the responsibility to set how much we're willing to pay. But those details beyond that, I think we need to have a discussion about where that should be aligned and how much we should be doing and how much should be delegated to the CEO. So I think we can have that conversation. But I don't see any more hands going up on this issue, so we'll call the question. Let's vote on the motion. All those in favor? Do we need to repeat the motion? We've had a lot of conversation. So it's basically this statement with the addition of to encourage, what were the two words? Highly qualified. Highly qualified individuals. All right, so that's the motion. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Yes. Whoop, just a minute. Mr. Jones.
Yeah, I had pushed it. But I don't want to lose sight of what Dana's concerns were. So we still going to have narrative surrounding to address those issues.
And the only question is, where should those narratives be?
And I don't want to dictate where, but I think it's important that we don't lose sight.
So I think that'll be a direction from the chair, that we try to incorporate the critical elements somehow creatively in this, rather than us wordsmithing this afternoon.
Yeah, and I'd just say that in the policy, there's a section that discusses specific performance criteria, the strategic performance criteria, and obviously funded status is a subset of it that we could call out much more clearly. So.
Okay.
Just one other comment. So there will be individual plans that are presented, right? So I think to all of your points, it's not lost the comments and the weight that you're applying to today. So as those are applied to individuals, we could look to see how those are modified given the role they have in the organization, because it could be quite different from the investment office to other portions of the covered individuals. So, but I think we clearly hear what you're saying.
Okay. Comparator group.
Great. So the next couple slides represent the peers that have been relied on for the two different groups, the executive management and investment management specifically. Now, the executive management peer group is a little bit broader, very similar to what's used for investment management. However, it's focused on U.S. public funds, the leading Canadian public funds, select California-based agencies that have comparable scope, comparable employees, and are run by their own board. And then a general industry look at other asset managers, whether they be banks and insurance companies. And so the peer group that's been relied on historically is reflective of both the government perspective as well as comparable asset managers, regardless as to whether it's on the public or the private side. And if you go to page 7, it just kind of reflects the historical peers relied upon. Now, what I'll tell you is that so this was the approach that you all took in 2015. We followed a similar approach in 2016 and validated, the relationships relative to market. But our perspective is that this is a pretty darn good peer group in terms of getting as close as possible to organizations of comparable size and complexity, recognizing that CalPERS is still, the largest one, as part of the pensions, and taking a look, of course, at other comparable asset managers in industry. Now, recognizing our thought, it's a best practice peer group reflective of comparable pools of talent, organizations of comparable size and complexity. The ask here is, do you affirm that this continues to be the well-balanced peer group that would also reflect your talent pool for talent? Labor pool for talent, I should say.
Okay, Ms. Mather.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions, and forgive me for not remembering exactly, but this is a subset of a standard survey that is done by, I'm drawing a blank on the name of the provider, McLaughlin, correct? Right. And we picked these specific entities to be considered in the comparator group, is that right? So there are a couple that, there's one in particular that seems to be missing that I think we might want to consider under the Canadian pension funds, and that's BCI, the British Columbia Investment Management Corporation. That might be a good comparator. And I note also that we've got some retirement systems under the California-based agencies, but not under U.S. pension funds, which I thought was a little curious. Maybe it doesn't really matter what category we put them in, but. And then I guess I just wanted to be reminded, the banks, and so it's 50%, the target was 50% for all the public sector employers and 25% for banks and insurance companies. Is that where we had pegged it?
Doug Hoffner, CalPERS team. So I think you remembered it pretty close to what was happening back in 2015. McLaughlin was the firm that the board or committee picked to do the comparator group for both the investment management positions as well as the executive management positions. The investment one was done slightly earlier in prior 2 years before then. And I'm looking at it, I'm looking at the deck that was provided by them back in 2015. I want to say they did break out a ratio of data was weighted 50% on the median of financial large services. Is that the old policy? Okay. So the prior policy to that point that was modified was it was 50% weighted at the 75th percentile for large global U.S. and non-public sector firms with greater than $75 billion in assets, and then a weight to if only one sector was available, then weight to 100%. So what you guys went away from that, and we basically identified mission-driven organizations that were similar size, complexity, scope, that had investment classes, they had a call center, they had a contact kind of center, they had similar roles and responsibilities as CalPERS. The committee then identified those 10 California-based agencies as another comparator group that we would draw or lose talent to, and that was what was the subset that was selected back in August and September of 2015.
So the comparator group that is in front of us on page 7 is not the current comparator group? Is that what you're saying?
No, that's the existing one today.
That's the existing one today.
Yeah, and so you have U.S. funds, corporate plans, Canadian funds, and a select group of banks, insurance companies, and then the California-based entities, which is a differentiator from what we have in the investment management side of the house. Those were not included at that time.
Right. Okay. So just, I'm sorry. So I just want to make sure I understand you. So this list is more than 10. So you said there were 10. Did I
I'm sorry.
mishear something?
It's the California-based agencies.
Oh, those are the 10.
So yes, it's many more than that, but the committee specifically said we wanted to include other entities whereby we think we will lose talent to or attract talent
Yes.
from.
Right.
And they added what you see on that last bullet, and maybe it's more than 10. I didn't count it recently.
That's fine.
Sort of the rapid transit, the city of Los Angeles, LA County, some of the other systems. Those were called out specifically, and then McLaughlin helped provide data for those based upon that feedback from the committee at that time.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. So, I mean, I'm pretty comfortable with this comparator group. I mean, if I was to really think about who, I might consider expanding it beyond just U.S. and Canada pension funds, just given that our competitors now are truly global. I mean, we had our former private equity, and I know we're talking about the executive management group, but our former private equity MID went to the Middle East, went to China, and we've had people go from abroad, and we've actually recruited people from abroad. So we might want to think about that at some point. I don't know that it's an urgent issue, but that would be my one comment. Thank you.
Let me, before calling the next person, let me ask a question. I'm a little confused about what the mathematics are. So you have a comparative group, I get that. How is the math constructed? So when you come back next month and we actually look at numbers, how are the calculations done?
Yeah, our typical approach for hybrid type organizations like yours would just simply be to weight each of the peer groups comparably, and so it's a weighted average essentially of each one of the peer groups. Now, in this instance, and the one thing I will say is that primarily when, because I don't want there to be any perspective of inflation of the data, when we're taking a look at industry, we recognize that a significant portion of what is offered in the for-profit side of the house is in the form of equity. We're not taking a look at that historically. It's just total cash compensation, so it's salary plus bonus, exclusive as to the offering of long-term incentives. I mean, just being pragmatic.
You can't really get there.
Right.
Yeah,
so,
to use the data.
And so we're ignoring that altogether and just assuming it's total cash. So on the industry side, it is a conservative look from a for-profit side of the house standpoint, but it's also realistic. So we're just trying to come up with the best available data in a bit weighted average. So
I say, well, you weigh stock options against living in beautiful Sacramento, so maybe
that's right.
Maybe that's the trade-off. So do you? And when you do that, do you drop the highs and lows? Is there mathematical adjustments that are done, or is it just?
No, you can do statistical you can do statistical one-offs, but our approach is, because it is a broad peer group, just to weight it, just that we weight it equally, and the numbers are what they are.
All right, Mr. Jones.
Yeah, thank you. I thought I understood the statement, but I keep rereading it, and what's local in here? Sacramento?
SMUD.
Local public agencies, local public agencies.
Okay, and so California-based agencies are the ones you're referring to, the banks and the insurance companies? No? That's... Okay. So California-based agencies is this group on page 7. Let me see where. Okay. It's only primarily pension funds then.
Well, you've got.
It's a little different. Okay.
County of LA. And
okay. All right.
California.
Okay. I see. Now that I'm looking at the list, I understand. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Hollinger.
Yeah. Part of this is a bad trait about myself. I don't have a lot of patience, so I'm just curious. What's the maximum we can raise somebody right now?
Well, if it's Mr. Hoffner. I think.
Because I know we're going through all these gyrations, but I sit next to Mr. Gillihan, and what would be, there's got to be, because, I mean, the disparity when I look at insurance carriers, and I know what a chief actuary makes at a carrier versus here, and like, I'm just wondering if we're doing all of this and it's really kind of an exercise in futility because we can only go X because the optics won't look good.
Yeah.
Because,
Optics are different than authority.
Right.
So,
okay,
we'll
what's
discuss
the
that.
max?
Let me just kind of take a run at that, the Doug Hoffner, CalPERS team. So in your policy, you have established existing ranges for all these covered positions. That's solely within the board's authority under the Government Code 20098. Within that, you've got quartile minimums to max ranges for folks. So
Right.
they're set salary maxes today.
Right.
But that's predicated on a decision that the committee and board made in the past. You could change those things in the future to modify the existing compensation. And so when you say what's the limit, it's really tied typically to a salary survey and then data that would drive those decisions, but you have the authority to set compensation.
But, okay, so even having the authority to set compensation, could I set a 7-figure compensation today?
If it's within the range.
If it's
If it's
within,
appropriately agendized.
if it's appropriately agendized?
And if we set a range in public session, in public decision-making, that goes to that level, we have the authority to do that. Now, whether we choose to do it or not, that's all.
Right.
That's another issue. We can go to 10 million.
Okay, I didn't know if there was,
Note that Mr. Gillihan said we can go to 10 million.
right.
Not saying I would vote for it, I'm just saying.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, then why are we so below I mean, and for so long?
Well,
So just
I
over
think
the years, we haven't
over
taken
the
the
years.
What?
action to do anything differently. Because we set the salary ranges, the board set the salary ranges until the board changes those salary ranges. We can't do anything, and for different reasons, the board hasn't taken action to change them, even though we've done salary surveys. and
You know,
presented.
I'm coming from the private sector, so I'm just saying it's made it very challenging to appropriately run the organization. Okay, so got it.
all right. Mr. Costigan.
So again, I just want to weigh in a little bit on the comparator group. So first of all, answer Ms. Hollinger's question. I think over the years, the board has been concerned about raising salaries because of the perception of it. I think what the last couple of years has really shown is and we took it up in finance and admin earlier today, we've gotten the budget under control, we've taken moves to strengthen the fund. Each of this is a component in strengthening the system, and I think what we're getting to now is the compensation issue. I just want to talk a little on the comparative side. I think, as you may know, one of my partners is chair of the Regents, and I'm constantly looking more at UC as a comparator. Just to put a little context, the chancellor of the University of California, Los Angeles, made $428,480 last year. Currently, the chancellor of UCSF makes $819,545, not including other incentives they get. On UCLA, very quickly, the economic impact that UCLA creates is $12.7 billion for the region, and they pay approximately $1.8 billion in taxes at federal, state, and local level. CalPERS generated $9.6 billion in California activity last year, including nearly $2.2 billion in Los Angeles and nearly $2 billion alone in Sacramento. So when you start looking at sort of this comparison just to other public sectors, not picking on UCLA, fine school, yet or UCSF for that matter, at $819,000. What our staff does, from the investment office down, the board just has to make the realization that we've got to pay higher salaries. And I think Ms. Mather is correct. And when we look at some of these other organizations, and I know the banks and the insurance companies, part of that is proprietary. If I recall correctly, at least they fit, it was $150 billion to $300 billion. So at least from a comparative group, it was somewhat similar. We can figure out kind of who they are, but without knowing them. But again, I think the Regents last year gave a 20% increase in the pay of their chancellors. And that's just the chancellor's office. That's not talking about the president's. But if even we're just doing a comparison on economic modeling, UCLA generates only 12.7. We're doing almost 10 billion just in California alone, and our salaries are nowhere near that. So, in answer to your question, Ms. Hollinger, is the reason we're having this meeting, and I think we're doing June, is to begin addressing the salary disparities.
Mr. Gillihan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just, maybe another perspective to this discussion, and that is we should pay the price we need to get the people with the talent we need. Right. And I would submit that we've got a talented team here, and that the salaries have not been necessarily a problem. But as time moves on, we do need to revisit this. And with Mr. Eliopoulos' planned departure, I think that we're going to have to take a hard look at that. I'm not opposed to paying the right salary for the right skill set, but I think we need to have a need before we just decide we're going to raise salaries. I mean, these are public funds. These are the members' retirement funds, and every dollar we spend on salary is a dollar that's not in a perf generating investment returns. So as a fiduciary, there's a balance there. And I'm not at all opposed to raising salaries to get the talent we need. But, there's a bit of a chicken and egg here. I don't think we need to just outright raise salaries. We can perhaps look at our corridors or our ranges and where we benchmark somebody within that relative to our peer group. But, it should be based on a demonstrated need.
If the people don't mind who are scheduled to speak, Mr. Junkin's on the phone. I think maybe this is an appropriate time to get a read from him, because we're going to face this vacancy. And, Andrew, you there?
I am.
All right. So what does the market look like?
Well, it's certainly become a much more lucrative market for investment professionals over the last, really, I think it's accelerated quite a bit over the last 3 or 4 years. Looking at some information in preparation for this meeting, you can really see that. And one of the data sources that I looked at was focused on university endowment CIOs, which I would suggest for the investment comparator group would be worth considering adding, because a number of the CIOs for the university endowments are former public plan CIOs. So they are, whether you like it or not, a competitor of yours. And they've peeled off some of the talent here. But there's, in this particular data source, there's 107 CIOs. Total pay is listed as of 2014, so it's a little out of date. If you're looking at kind of top third, it's a pretty big number. It's about $1 million a year 3 years ago. So likely to be somewhat higher from there. So I think the market really has changed a lot in the last few years. Certainly unemployment in the U.S. overall at 3.9% has tightened up a lot of things in the job market, but certainly there's no shortage of opportunities in the investment business. And to get back to some of the comments earlier about talented individuals, you are going to have to pay up for that. I had one more comment. Let me see if I can scroll back. I've forgotten it. I want to go back, see if I can trigger it again.
Do you have the 50% number by chance?
I do. It is total comp would have been $775,000 3 years ago.
3 years ago. Okay.
And some of these numbers, don't get me wrong, some of these numbers are off the charts insane, right? There's a handful of people that make more than $5 million a year.
Make more than what? I'm sorry?
$5 million.
So it's quite a dispersion.
There is. And so I think, the top third is probably a reasonable group to compare against, given that, they are university endowments. I would suggest that world tends to be a little bit more highly comped than the public fund world. But you are competing there, and some of the names on the list, Brett Harris was a public fund CIO of some repute. Lisa Mazzocco. I mean, there's a few on here that have just gotten peeled off, and so I think that's a risk that you run.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Mather. Whoop.
Sorry.
Is that okay, Andrew? Did you have another comment?
I think it was Mr. Gonzaga had a comment, and then
Okay.
I'm happy to
Go
wait
ahead.
till he's done.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up and say that, like Andrew, we work with and study what goes on with respect to the private, foundations, whether it's the university or just, charitable foundations. And I think that working with, working with a couple, I'll give you some references within the last year where we worked with one private foundation to the tune of about $12 billion and another university foundation that managed about $1 billion in assets. And in both instances, the CIO, based on their philosophy, was compensated right at $1 million or in excess of $1 million. Pretty heavily salary-based with a modest amount, annual incentive-based. But it's just more to indicate what Mr. Junkin was discussing is certainly comparable in our experience as well. So.
Thank you for that. So with that feedback, and I think both the comments by Mr. Junkin and by Mr. Gonzaga are really helpful, I would move that we modify the executive management comparator group to include BCIMC, the UC Office of, I guess I should say the Executive Management Comparator Group is not the Investment Management Comparator Group. So for the Executive Management Comparator Group, I would add sort of the BCIMC, and then but otherwise affirm the existing group. For the Investment Management Comparator Group, I would actually, perhaps we should think about replacing the investment management advisory firms, banks, and insurance companies with university endowments as a category, and also add BCIMC as a Canadian pension fund that we should, and the UC Office of the CIO, which manages the UC pension system, also as another pension fund that we consider in our comparator group.
Would you mind splitting the issue? So let's do the executive first, the motion.
That's fine.
You want to
So-
make that motion?
Yeah, so both of them are a motion, so I'll happy to split them if you'd
Okay.
like.
Let's take the executive one first. And does staff have down, does everybody understand the additions on the executive side?
Yeah.
Okay. And so moved by Mathers, seconded by Costigan. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Now the second part.
Second one is for the investment to modify the investment comparator group to replace the investment management advisory firms, banks, and insurance companies component with university endowment offices of the CIO, because obviously it's not just for the CIO position, it's for other investment management positions within the our organization. So, and they also employ other investment management folks. So, and then also to add, again, BCI and the UC Office of the CIO to the comparator group as well.
Second.
Yes. Just a minute. Ms. Hollinger first.
Oh, I was just going to respond to Mr. Gillihan and just say that I think having this salary where it is really inhibited Marcy's ability to attract a head of private equity, because, people who run, we have the largest private equity portfolio on the planet right behind CCPIB, and I can tell you, the Canadians pay, they're not at the top of the market, but they're in line, and so I think it inhibits our ability to attract the right talent that we need, especially when we're, what we're looking to do in the future. I really think I'd want to know that we had the ability to get the top person.
Okay, we had, that was a motion by Ms. Mather.
And I second.
And you seconded, Ms. Hollinger
Could I,
seconded.
just
Sure.
one comment?
Yeah.
I know that, and this is just my suggestion, I do agree adding the endowments and the university funds makes sense. I would still include, I mean, at least for reference point, you know, industry, you know, advisory firms or what have you, because a couple reasons. One, we're just talking about total cash compensation. We're not including the equity that they often get. The other component is that recognizing your competition for talent. This is just one data point, and you know, it's one of 5 different peer groups at this point if we add the endowments. So I think at least it gives that secondary reference check as opposed, it's not going to go all the way up to the for-profit numbers.
Okay,
So-
well, I'm comfortable with
consider-
that. I'm comfortable with that. I can.
So you're making an addition to that as
So
opposed to a replacement.
yeah, so I won't say that's replacing that, but that it's in addition to
Addition.
that, we're adding a category on university endowment CIO offices. investment
Okay.
offices.
So that's now the motion. That's the motion on the floor. Mr. Costigan.
I think just a
Wait a minute, I
couple of
need to,
things.
wait a second.
It's lit.
I gotta cancel some people here. Press your button. Oh, you're
No,
on.
I'm-
Go ahead.
So I just want to make sure, we're talking about university endowments, and we're talking about the University of California Investment Office that we're adding in.
Yeah, it's, yeah,
I just
restate
want to
it.
make sure it's UC.
Restate it to make sure. You got your button? I don't see you on here. Oh, there we go. All right.
Yeah, so what I'm adding in is the UC Office of the CIO, the BCIMC, which is the British Columbia Investment Management Corporation, which manages assets on behalf of several pension funds, as well as other university endowment offices of the CIO, so they're investment offices.
So the chief investment officer of the regions. And then I'm just curious, since we're adding a few, why was like LA County Fire and Police left out? Why didn't we use some of the, I mean, we have US pension funds, but why didn't we use some of our local government pension peers? LA, San Diego, Contra Costa.
They're going to drag your average down.
Yeah.
They're going to drag it down? Okay.
A lot of them are fully
They don't pay.
outsourced, externally managed, not internally managed,
Okay.
don't have
Just
internal
curious.
managed
I
capabilities.
want to make sure, because
all for
typically
adding them.
they do it the other way. Typically, locals drag our salaries up. So, all right, thank you.
Okay, Mr.
I
Hoffner.
just want to ask one question. So Andrew, I know, has provided, I've seen some data related to endowments. As you make modifications, and we want to bring information back in the near future, like June, that we're able to get more up-to-date, I think he referenced 2014 endowment data, so I don't know if it's through Andrew or others that we'd be able to give you that information so we can take an appropriate action. So I'm not by opposed to any of this, but I just want to make sure we can actually collect that information that's more current as well. So I don't know, Andrew, if he's got a comment about that or he has the ability to get that data.
Andrew?
This is a report from Charles Scarino, which runs a recruiting firm in the Bay Area, and it's on their website. I presume there is more current data. It's not something that I have at hand.
Okay.
But
So-
I suspect it's out there, and perhaps Mr. Scarina could provide an updated version.
Well, you're going to use your best efforts to get this
Yeah,
budget.
so I just want to make sure so we'll do
We understand.
what we can to gather the information
understand. It may
and bring
not
that back
all
to you at an
happen.
appropriate time. Yeah.
We'll try. Okay, so did we vote on this? No, we haven't voted yet. Okay. All right. Motion's on the table. No further discussion. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. All right, we're on to the target percentile discussion.
Yeah, and ultimately, this is probably, the greatest issue for you as an organization, in terms of, you think about where your current incumbents are positioned. From a CEO standpoint, I mean, historically, I think, total cash compensation, total compensation lag, the 25th percentile. For other executives, it tended to lie between the 25th and 50th percentile, all in. And then for investment management, salaries looked competitive on average but total cash compensation, lagged because incentive opportunities are just so different, when you look at industry. And so with all of that, again, our recommendation would be to, like most organizations, the best practice is to target compensation at the 50th percentile. And all that means, it's that middle of the market. It's what's deemed fair. Again, I think there would probably need to be a transition over time to move to that, as well as an assessment of, when are folks appropriately positioned at the 50th percentile? Because again, a 50th percentile philosophy means if you take a good, a very well qualified performer who's been around for 5-6 years and has done quite well over those years, that individual tends to be positioned at the 50th percentile. If they're new, they tend to be positioned somewhere probably 20% below the 50th percentile. And if they've been a great performer for 10, 12 years, maybe they're up towards the maximum. Now, so all of that being said, that's what we would think is the typical philosophy. There's cost associated with it. There's optical issues associated with it. But I would just recommend, because what we're doing is we're taking a look at a blend of government, tax exempts, for-profit organizations, and we're only taking a look at total cash compensation. Our recommendation would be what's fair. Well, we'd say the middle of the market when you take into account all of those various market segments, and move to it over a couple-year period of time, as you see fit, and adopt ranges that reflect that. So with all of that, I mean, what is the committee's perspective in terms of what is that right targeted percentile?
Mr. Gillihan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, this conversation certainly woke me up. I would ask the question, why do we even need percentiles? Why do we need them? If we have a range, top to bottom, that could span $500,000 or more, I don't know, could be even deeper than that, and we're trying to get the talent we want. I mean, why would we put a sort of an artificial boundary on ourselves when we're going to have a range, and this board has full authority to move anybody within that range based on what it costs to get them here, how they're performing, what it's going to cost to keep them here? What's the point of a percentile?
Well, my view of it is that it's in our mind of what we think we're going to need to be, where we're going to need to be. So the idea is to do this without the numbers, because the question is, how are we going to position ourselves in the marketplace? So we're still at the theoretical level. We're not actually at the range level. But unless we say, where do we think we should be compensating people in order to get the proper talent? And we should be willing to have a general, it's just like our purpose statement. It's where we think we should be. Where we end up is a different story. Then we get into the practical realities of where people are now. It seems too much. Sacramento's a nice place to live. You've got a lot of considerations that come into play. But if you're in a competitive marketplace, I think we at least need to determine where generally should we be in these competitive positions. That's the reason.
And I guess I would just counter that when we create sort of this artificial marker in the middle of a salary range, we now have to speak to it when we exceed it or when we go below it. But if we're operating within a range, we plug them in wherever they are.
How do you set the range, though?
They're going to do it with the comparator groups. We're going to have a range top to bottom. Why would we put ourselves, if we're saying we're CalPERS, we're the preeminent pension organization in the United States, perhaps in the world, and we want the best talent, why would we say, but we're only going to pay you at the middle of the market?
So,
well, no, Mr. Gillihan, I think that what I would point out is that what we're trying to do is establish the range midpoint at the competitive market rate and just build a range up or down above and below that midpoint, so you can go up 20, 30% above or below that range. based on experience. That's typically how salary ranges are set, is where it's driven by what's the market. It could be the 50th, it could be the 75th percentile. We tend to recommend the 50th. And then the range is just built around that. So
I can appreciate that. I guess what I'm saying is why are we doing it the same way everybody else does it? And why don't we just take whatever that range is, drop the 20% off the top and 20% off the bottom and call it a day?
I think part of the problem is
done.
I think part of the problem is, in some cases, that is the dispersion of these is going to be so significant, it's going to be hard to set that range without setting some target to work from. We may decide that even though we want to be at 50th percentile, for this particular job, we're going to have to be at, the range is going to be 70 to 20. It may not fit exactly, but the question is, what's our target? It's just a target. We're not tied to it. That's my view. But let's see what other people say. Mr. Costigan.
So I do agree with Mr. Gillihan, just from the standpoint, I guess there are two ways to look at it. Now, I understand exactly what he's talking about as it relates to the target. The difference is, I think we're sort of the same thing, is I'm more interested in setting a ceiling and letting folks negotiate inside of that. Whether we call that a target or not, I mean, the issue is, we all seem to agree that we need to change salaries and move it. And I would respectfully disagree. I think Mr. Slate, one is, it's not the board has setting authority for salaries. We don't have authority to negotiate what someone's going to be paid. That's up to HR and the only exempt that we have, our CEO. The other concern I have, and I was just thinking about this while I see Mr. Jacobs in the way back, while we suddenly start talking about salaries and targets, it's my understanding with the passage of new legislation enacted by the governor, you can't ask people's salaries. So I'm just kind of curious now, as if I can't ask Doug how much he used to make, and I now know what the range is, we're all kind of operating blindly a little bit on the negotiating, as opposed to if we're just setting the ceiling, we're now giving the ability for you to go out and negotiate on it. Because I'm just trying to reconcile the two, is if I don't know what the base, so we set a target, we're saying to someone, hey, here's the range we're going to pay. Now you come in, but I don't know whether you're in that range or not. I have to look at your record because I can't ask about your past salary now. Is it better, as to Mr. Gillihan's point, to just say, here's the dollar amount, set a ceiling? Are they sort of, are targets and ceilings the same thing kind of in this discussion or not?
I would say yes, because
I want our HR to agree to.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I want all you agree, but I sort of see nodding behind. Yes. No?
Who's nodding back there?
Okay. All right, go ahead. Sorry, keep going. Sorry.
Well, no, I was
don't
just,
move.
yeah. I think, part of the reason for constructing a range around typical market practice is because we know that's what other organizations do, and they will develop their ranges around a 50th percentile midpoint. And so therefore, we also know that from a maximum standpoint, they'd set their maximum 20% above the 50th percentile. So it's intended to do a couple things. One, give you the array of what's reasonable out there in the marketplace. And the second piece is give you plenty of flexibility, to recruit, retain the right people, and give you plenty of latitude to reward for performance as well. So.
Maybe our folks.
Yeah, maybe I'll just speak to a little bit about the opportunity that the governor gave us with not asking salary, and we've actually had to already think about things a little bit differently. We do post what the salary is. And we can offer what we think is a fair salary, and they can actually come back and say, well, I actually make more money than that. I'm going to counteract. Yeah, so there is still some flexibility in us doing that. I'm just addressing specifically that legislation and how we're looking at that.
That assumption is they make more than what we're offering, as opposed to the fact we don't know that they made less.
Right.
And you can't ask.
Right.
So I can still come back and say, I made more, but that's what I'm just trying to get at, is I'd rather give the discretion and have here's the universe, go forth and find the best people. I think when we start micromanaging ranges, and again, this is I've had the evolution over the past few years from standard state civil service where we have classifications and ranges and all that, is that I think we have to look at this group of folks slightly different because of what they do and who we actually compete with, and then who we're losing people to. I mean, the last thing I want, and I think we've talked a little bit about this in the health area, is you don't want to become the brain drain. We do all the training, and you churn and burn, and out they go. And we need to, I think Mr. Gillahan said this earlier today, or maybe it was in finance and admin, things are changing. We need to really be focused on the long game, long term here at our organization, and that means retaining people. And compensation has been an issue in retention. We've had turnover. At the end of the day, I agree with Mr. Slayton. Sacramento is a great place to live. It only compensates for so much, and then when you take in again the federal tax policy, some of the other compensation issues, we need to do this. So thank you, Mr. Slayton.
Yeah,
Ms.
and
Mott?
just another fine point on that. Once they disclose their salary, we can have that conversation. We just can't ask for it up front.
Right, exactly. Yeah, Ms. Mather.
So are we looking, the staff recommendation does not include making a motion on this, but are you looking for this range today? So then I would move that we adopt a range for both the executive management positions and the investment management positions of between 25% and 75% of the comparator group. Does that seem, is that in line? I know, that's what you said.
Okay, would you repeat that one more time?
I move that we set the range for the executive management positions to between 25% and 75th percentile of the executive management comparator group, and for the investment positions between 25% and 75% of the investment management comparator group.
Second.
Okay, moved by Mather, seconded by Gillahan. So you reverse them the way you described them. There's nothing in that message, right? It's 25 to 75, right, for both of them. You did. You just reversed the orders of them, so that's okay. It's all right. 25 to 75. Yeah.
But a 50th percentile target. I mean, because that's what you're basing your, typical competent executive or leader. They tend to be positioned right at that 50th percentile. So I know you want a lot of flexibility, but just it's always good to have that kind of standard bearer, typical employee, typical executive. So
Can I, let me just, Ms. Mather.
I guess I would just say that depending on the position, I think the CEO would set what the target is for an individual position. So I don't think the board should set what that target should be at our level. I can see you disagree with me, Eric. But I think,
No. I don't
Okay.
disagree. I mean, I think that that's a great delegation. Consistency can be a good thing, but you think about. But it would be important to know at the board. It's certainly the CEO can have flexibility there, but in terms of your overall preferences, building a range around the 25th to 75th percentile is very easy to do. But there's also, when you think about designing incentive plan goals and expected payouts, et cetera, it's always good to know what that expected target payout is in terms of if we're going to deliver total cash at the 50th percentile. That should also be reflective. Okay, these are expected goals that we need to achieve to get to the 50th percentile total cash. And so
yeah, I guess I would say again that is that is under the CEO's purview, and perhaps not the board's purview. In your experience, does the board set those targets for all of the executives?
just as a general matter, and to the extent that you have a philosophy, a target for the CEO or a couple of the other top positions, it just tends to carry all the way down through the organization. So,
well, I can see how that might be something we would want to set for the CIO, but let's move forward with these two things, and we can maybe talk about a target if we want to, or even at a later date, perhaps.
I wonder if we want to defer this to June when we have more information. I know it's an action item right now.
Well, and
How do
just
people feel?
Just as a reminder, if we're looking at going to total salary to be effective in July, we do have to make some decisions today and to definitely solidify in June.
Gotcha.
Just as a reminder.
Just the calendar's not our friend in this case.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So what action do we have to take today?
We have a motion on the floor.
I know, I'm just trying to understand from staff. I understand we have a motion on the floor. You need direction on,
Yeah, so I would just go back to, right now, we're thinking about the CEO plan and going to total salary. So you would want to be prepared to develop that plan. She now, or he, will no longer have a plan as far as an incentive plan. So if you're looking to set salary, which I believe we are looking to set salary in June, you would have to already know what that target is so that we can come back and provide you what the range is. And that median that Mr. Gonzaga spoke about, that's the industry, it's just the way that they do that.
Well, you can always provide us with the median, even if we haven't set it as a specific target. Right?
that's correct.
That's right. That's right. And so, I mean, I think the takeaway is that you want us to bring forth, typical range based on market practices. And, certainly a lot of that is going to be centered around the 50th percentile, but we'll present the presentation relative to the 25th and 75th. Those are the parameters for the min and maximum. And we'll go forward from there. So.
Okay, Ms. Hollinger.
Yeah, I was agreeing a bit with Mr. Costigan that kind of like us setting, I'm very good and obviously I support Ms. Mather's motions, but one of the things in these positions is, we're the largest asset owner in the largest capital market in the country, so I just want to make sure that the ceiling's there because the people that work here are ripe to be picked by our competitors who can pay significantly more. So I agree with having a ceiling.
Mr. Gillihan.
Just looking forward to a vote on this item.
With you. Yeah.
Mr. Miller.
Yeah, I like the idea that Mr. Gillihan put out there about a range that kind of has a ceiling and gives you discretion. The thing that I'm a little bit cautious about is percentile versus percentages. So, for example, if you're going to go 45 to 55 percentile, the midpoint 50 is the same as 25th to 75th, but the dispersion can be dramatically different. One or two blips on percentile can be huge amounts of variation. And so something more like the 50th percentile plus 20% of that might be a more sensible way to set a range, absent having some idea about the distribution of those comparator salaries for any given position, because that 25th percentile could be up in the $10 million range for all I know.
No, there can be, depending on the data set, the 75th and 25th percentile can be quite volatile, just because you're talking about a smaller sample size at that point. But, understood, and we'll come back with the recommendations accordingly.
Well, we're going to see the data, so we're going to see what it does. All right, so let's call the question on the motion. All those in favor of the motion, signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Okay. Let's see, I think does that complete our work, or you've got more? That's our decisions, okay.
That's it.
Summary committee direction. Mr. Hoffner.
Yeah, so I took some notes here. I think the biggest one was not losing sight of, you had this funded status conversation, so how do we take that back and sort of incorporate it, and then really providing the data. We talked about the endowments and some other areas to make sure we have the appropriate information to bring back for the next meeting. And I think that was effectively it. The rest were handled through the motions that were adopted by the committee. So I think that covers it.
Okay, I have no requests for public comment. Anybody in the audience want to make public comment? If not,
Can I make one request?
Yes, sir.
And I just want to be clear on this as well, because the fixed salary versus, salary plus variable. And so when we talk about coming back with options, do we come back with salary-only options or salary plus the variable? I mean, that's something that I know we got to address in June, so.
Okay. I would lean toward the salary plus variable. Well, you can bring both, and we can look at them.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Just
All right,
wanted
so
to verify that.
That's the direction of the chair.
Thank you.
All right, meeting adjourned.
Yeah, so Richard, that's what we're trying to